I'm Ricky Schlott with the New York Post, and today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Dr. Jordan Peterson to discuss his upcoming book, We Who Wrestle with God, which is out on November 19th.
And so you have a remarkable ability to get young people excited about things that might not be so sexy to them at the first glance.
Like sexy.
So how do you get young people to be excited about something that, I mean, it's really a feat of a tome of like a dissection of biblical text. How do you get young people invigorated about such a serious and dense topic?
That's a great question. Well, I think the chapter on Abraham is, first of all, I would say you need to know who you are. Like, we have a crisis of identity in our culture. Obviously, the culture war is a crisis of identity. Well, this is a book about identity. It's about the identity of the divine and its relationship with man and woman, let's say, and culture for that matter. And that's an analysis of the core of identity, or you could say the core of harmonious identity, or the identity that is good. Now, maybe you don't believe that such a thing exists. Well, good luck to you. No, I'm saying that in a truly ironic manner. You're in a form of hell if that's what you believe. It may be a nihilistic hell or a power-driven hell or a hedonistic hell, but it's a form of hell. And you might not think that hell exists. It's like if you're there long enough, you'll start to believe in it. More specifically, there are keys. One of the keys is in the book of Abraham, because the book of Abraham details out the meaningful pathway of life, which isn't security, safety, hedonic self-gratification, any of that. It's adventure. Well, and people know that. It's like, what do you want from your life? You want to be taken care of like an infant? You have all your needs are requited the moment that you manifest one? People are at your beck and call? What, you going to lay unconscious in your crib? Or do you want to be James Bond? You want to have an adventure, or maybe a romantic adventure? That'd be a good deal. Okay, how? That's what's in the book of Abraham. It tells you how. And part of the key to that is that these three things are the same: truth, responsibility, and adventure. Those are the same thing. So I make that case in the book, and it's exciting. It's a very exciting thing to know. The most adventurous pathway forward, which is also the most meaningful pathway forward, is the one that involves the voluntary bearing of the maximum amount of responsibility. That's the symbol of the cross, by the way. And why is that? Well, let's say you go and watch a secret agent movie. Well, what's James Bond trying to do? He's trying to save Western civilization, or he's trying to save the world. Well, that's responsibility. Without that responsibility, there wouldn't be any adventure. There's nothing at stake. And if there's nothing at stake, there's no meaning. So all this responsibility that, let's say, the hedonist flees from, it's like, fair enough, you can degenerate into your infantile self-gratification, but you lose the major source of intrigue. And it depends to some degree on how you think human beings are constituted. If it's each according to his need, that's so pathetic. It's like, who are you? You're just a bottomless pit of consumption. Well, no wonder you are fat and miserable. It's appalling. It's an appalling view. You're a contender on a brutal landscape, and you can do it. And so that's a fun thing to know. And why is that associated with truth? Because you have to give yourself up if you're going to tell the truth. Because you don't know what's going to happen. But that's insanely interesting, because you don't know. It's like, what happens if I say this? Who knows? Who knows? God only knows. Yeah, well, that's right. That's exactly right. And let's say you decide you don't believe that, is that truth won't set you free. Well, you believe what? That falsehood will set you free? That's your theory. That's a stupid theory. Every time I talk about the link between responsibility and sustaining meaning, let's say, the audiences go quiet, because no one's told them that for like 70 years. Yeah. So yeah, and young men think, oh, and then they go try it, and it's like it works immediately. It starts to work immediately. And the reason I say, well, make your bed, is like, well, you can probably do that. Maybe your life is chaos, just hellish Israelites in the desert, chaos. And you don't know where to start. It's like, start where you can. Organize your sock drawer, make your bed. And it's also, see, it's a symbolic offering in the morning. It's actually, I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's still true. It's a recreation of the opening scene in Genesis, where God makes order out of chaos. Well, that's what you're called upon to do, because you're made in the image of God. It's like, make some order that is good out of chaos. Can you do that? Well, probably not very well, but there is something you could do. Could you make your bed? Could you make it one day a week instead of never? And just see what happens. Well, then you make your bed and you get a little discipline from that, just a little. Plus, you know exactly what to do when you wake up, right? And that's a good thing to know, because there's a transition there. It's like you wake up and the day is uncertain and maybe your life is in disorder. You don't know what to do because there's just too much chaos around you. It's like, I get up and I make my bed. And then maybe I get up and I make my bed and I have a shower and then I have something to eat. There's a routine. Think routine, that boxes me in. It's like, you want to be boxed in a lot. Maybe you want to open the box in one corner so you can look out. But if the box is completely open and you're revealed in all your nakedness to the world, it's like, you think you can tolerate that, do you? I don't think so. So the invitation is, it's an invitation to adventure. It's like, figure out who you are. In the Lion King movie, you remember what's his name? Simba. He's out being a useless, hedonistic adolescent with this stomach. That's that pig, and that sort of sycophantic meerkat, his cronies. And then Nella shows up and shames him. Right now he's all confused because he's just doing his own thing and she can't stand him because he's a useless, hedonic, narcissistic infant. And she lets him know that there's some things to do. So then he has this shamanic transformation experience down into the depths, right? Because he's racked with doubt. He goes to the bottom where he finds a pool of clear water and reflects. And in his reflection, he sees the son, his father, right? The heavenly son, his father, and Mufasa says, remember who you are, right? Well, that's what this book is. It's a call to the deepest strata of memory. Plato, Socrates believed that all learning was remembering. Well, there's truth in that. We don't conceptualize it that way in the modern world because we think learning is the pulling in of, say, objective data, something, which it isn't, by the way. That's not true. It is remembering. Remember who you are. Well, you're Abraham, you're Moses, you're Sarah, you're Adam, you're Noah. Well, obviously, who else would those stories be about? And so I believe that if you lived your life, you would be all those characters. All of those things would happen to you. Because everyone goes through a time of storms. Everyone inhabits a Tower of Babel. Everyone commits the sin of pride. Everyone has a call to adventure. Everyone should stand up against tyranny and slavery. Well, that's all part of the human experience. So I'm explaining that.
I only recently in the past year or so myself really leaned into my Christian identity, but I see much more frequently that it's new young men who are turning that way. I'm more of an anomaly. And I saw this set of I hope so.
Likely. Given who you are, it's likely.
Thank you. And I saw the status set recently that in any generation in recent memory, women tend to be more religious than their male counterparts. Gen Z flips that entirely, and it's actually considerably more men. It's not just that there's a trend one way, it's like a 180. What do you think is causing that? Is it?
Now, first of all, we shouldn't compare men and women of the same age. That's foolish because women prefer men who are 4 years older cross-culturally. So we should really compare the 21-year-old men with the 17-year-old women. From what I understand about what's happening in universities, it's 2-to-1 women to men now in universities, but there's some data showing that women stop going then. Once the ratio is too skewed, the women stop going. And you might say, why? It's like, well, why do people go to university? No, maybe 80%. because you got to ask yourself, well, why would you pay $300,000 for an Ivy League education? It's like, well, how about you find your partner? What's that worth? And those schools used to select, right? So that was a pretty good deal. You got to go in there and your potential pool of peers and mating partners was pretty nicely selected. So maybe that was worth $300,000. Highly probable. It's not like we know what universities do, but that's certainly one of the things they do. Yeah. So, okay, so the men, what are the men doing? Well, the men are listening to Jonathan Pageau, and they're listening to me. And I explained this. It's like, this isn't, you haven't got anything better to do. Go do the best thing. Why would you do anything else? Well, I won't get what I want. It's like, you don't even know what you want, right? So why is this happening? Because the alternatives are dreadful. That's really why. The alternatives are dreadful. You know, there's one way of doing things right, and there's a million ways of doing things wrong, or a trillion. So you wander off the straight, narrow path at your peril. And the farther you get away from it, the more dismal the landscape. And then the monsters come, right? And our society, like, you can see that. If you can't see that, you're blind. You're blind. We're sterilizing and mutilating children in the name of compassion, right? And that is not the end of it, right? Right. There's no limit to the monstrous forms. In times of chaos, there's a call for not revolution, although that can happen. And that's not advisable. There's a call for renewal. That's much better. Well, that's what's happened. There's a renewal. Now, that's happened in the United States many times, right? The United States is quite remarkable for its waves of religious renewal. Well, that's what's happening. There's another one coming or starting. So, and I think it'll be a different one, because this time I think it will be associated with a much deeper level of conscious understanding. Because I actually think we can understand these stories now, not only believe them. You know, like when you go see a movie, you believe the story. Because like, what are you doing? You're sitting in there being skeptical. You know, you tap the person on the shoulder who's in the next row and say, you know, those are just drawings. None of this is real. They say, you know, shut up. Why? Because they believe the story. Right. Well, our religious stories were like that. We believed them, like we're embedded in a movie, let's say, or in a drama. That doesn't work for us. We're sufficiently critically minded so that mere immersion isn't sufficient. We have to understand, but we can understand. So this is a new thing. Well, you see one, that young men are returning to the church and to the more traditional forms, right? So the more traditional the church, the more popular it's becoming. And I think there's a reason for that. So I've attended a fair number of Orthodox services with my friend Jonathan Pageau, and they're very ritualized. And so unlike a Protestant ceremony, say, or service, which is much more dependent on the preacher, well, you can't criticize an Orthodox service. It's like going to a ballet and saying, like, what's going on here? Well, that's a stupid question. What does that mean, those dances on the stage? It's like the dance is the meaning. There's no getting under that. You can not like it, but you can criticize it from within its confines. You could see, well, I've seen better ballets, but you can't say, well, what the hell is this? Well, it's the same thing in an Orthodox ceremony. It's ritualized. It's a dance. And it's not the words only. It's the words in the architecture, in the images, in the history. And so you're in it. You're participating in it. So it's very resistant to the kind of caustic semantic criticism that's been leveled at the religious foundation. And so it's, for modern people, it's more satisfying. And it's partly because we're so distant from that. It's an embodied form of worship, right? And we don't even know what that means. Well, that's what you do when you dance with someone you love. That's an embodied form of worship, if you're fortunate. And you can't argue about those things. You know, they're outside of the realm of argumentation. And we don't even believe that such a realm exists, especially if we're postmodern. Everything's in the text. It's like, yeah, right, have it your way, you know, which is what you want. So we've departed far enough from the foundations, that a radical return to the foundation is, well, it's either that or it's a collapse. Those are the alternatives. Well, I'm sorry. There's three alternatives. There's a totalitarian alternative. There's an utter chaos alternative, and those just interplay. Or there's a renewal path. Those are the options. There's no other options. And, you know, the chaos path, the psychopaths love that because they can take advantage of the chaos to manipulate. So they're fomenting chaos constantly. And then there's the totalitarians who want, you know, everything locked down. And there can be religious totalitarians, clearly. The Chinese have taken that path. And so chaos, totalitarian, that's the flood, chaos. Tower of Babel, that's the totalitarian state, the all-seeing eye of Sauron, or what? Or what? The golden path. To what? Well, that's what the book's about.
One word that I feel like gets thrown around sometimes flippantly in our culture right now is accusations of Christian nationalism on the right. What do you make of that discourse?
That could easily happen. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there are reasons for it too, is that Islamic fundamentalism is probably the fundamental reason. It's not the only one. It's like the Islamic fundamentalists, they're not messing around. And we don't know what exactly to do about it. Neither do the, let's say, the oppressed people of Iran. Iran was a pretty sophisticated society in the 1970s. And then the Islamic Republic came in, and it was like the 13th century psychopathic thugs have arrived, and they're not very happy with women because if they don't oppress them, they run away. So, you know, better to put them in a bag and chain them to a bed. And then you've got what you want because you're not going to get it any other way because you're a totalitarian thug. So any woman with any sense is going to make tracks away from you. So they've got the upper hand. Now, thing about people like that is naive, weak people are fodder for them. So if the West is going to withstand that sort of fundamentalism, even within the West for that matter, the sort of naive virtue that we associate with idiot compassion, that's just laughable. So part of that nationalism is a rekindling of the spirit of self-defense. Now, that doesn't mean it can't go wrong. It goes wrong all the time. But the fact that it can go wrong doesn't mean it's wrong in its essence. I mean, the warrior is an element of hero. Now, what do you do with the warrior? Well, that's a good question. The warrior should be subordinate. To what? Right? To what? What should sexuality be subordinate to? What should aggression be subordinate to? That's the divine hierarchy. That's the question. You know, what's at the pinnacle that unites? And the postmodernists, they would say, well, there is no pinnacle and there's no union. It's like, have it your way. Then you have disunion and chaos, which is what the bloody postmodernists wanted because most of them were hedonistic narcissists. So Foucault's works are an intellectual justification of his perversions. Seriously. And he's very smart. Like, don't get me wrong, Michel Foucault, he's smart. But Lucifer is the intellect that's gone most spectacularly wrong. So if the intellect is serving the base desires, let's say, which was absolutely 100% true, even by means of historical record with regard to Foucault, it's like, look the hell out. And, you know, he was a massively destabilizing force.
And what sort of attitude did you hope a young person, I mean, even for me, I was steeped in postmodernism with my education. So when someone who might be a religious skeptic or even agnostic or atheist who might be approaching your book, how would you hope somebody, in what spirit? Yeah, in what spirit?
Well, look, when you're reading, you're trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. That's what a critical reader does. A critical reader doesn't find something that bothers them and throw away the book. Now, maybe you do if it's not a book of quality, let's say. You should bring your skepticism to the book. Like, come at it with, you know, all arms in place. Reading is investigation. So you want to investigate. Like, not uncritically, critically as you can. But the point is to separate the wheat from the chaff. You know, I read many books, and often the book will have like no ideas or one or two. And then there are other books, Nietzsche's books are a good example, where every sentence is an idea. And so you gather all that, and that's how you approach a text. You gather what's relevant and useful, and you discard the rest, and you use your critical judgment. And if you're sensible, you do it while you're aiming up. I want to learn. Why? Because I'm not walking with God in the garden. How about that? If you are, good for you. You've got nothing to learn. If you're not, maybe it's you. That's a good thing to know too, you know, because Cain, for example, in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain fails. And the reason he fails is complex. He doesn't make the proper sacrifices. So he's hiding his light under a bushel. He's not all in. And so things don't go well for him. And then instead of learning from that, he decides that the reason that he's not doing as well is because God made a flawed cosmos. You know, and that's quite a leap, really. It's like, it's me or God? It's God. Okay, so then he calls God out, says, what's going on here? Sacrificing away, and Abel has everything, and I have nothing. And God says, you're not really doing your best, and if you did, you'd be accepted. And so that's an interesting thing. It's like, if things aren't going your way, not exactly the right way of phrasing it. If your life isn't, if the golden path hasn't appeared, maybe it's you, and you better hope so, because if it's the cosmic order and it's set against you, you're in trouble. So maybe you're on your knees thinking, this isn't going so well. Is there anything I might be doing wrong? Well, Cain doesn't do that. He just blames God. And God says, you're so wrong, you can't imagine it. It's not even that you're failing that's made you bitter. Even that theory's wrong. Failure tempted you in the form of the sin that crouched at your door. And it's characterized in the text as a sexually aroused predatory animal. And you invited it in to have its way with you. And you knew it. It's not failure, misery. It's failure, bitterness, possession, vengefulness, enviousness, murderousness, unhappiness. And so that's what God tells Cain. Well, Cain's none too happy about that. So kills Abel. Well, that's one of the consequences of, say, deviating off the beaten path. And if you can't see that, if you can't see the wisdom in that, you haven't contemplated your own misery. So part of, you know, I mentioned earlier that you're all the characters in the story. That's the thing you have to understand. Is the book's about you? Weird as that is. But then you think, let's take the contrary proposition. It's not about you. Well, then who's it about? Like, even if you're atheistic, let's say, humans wrote the book. Okay, it's about us. Well, that's fine. Humans wrote the book. You know, that's true. It's incomplete truth, but it's true. Well, if humans wrote it's about us, that means it's about you. Well, that's quite the daunting realization. It's a description of the patterns of life. Cain and Abel's a great example of that. Those are the two fundamental patterns of life. And really, like absolutely, really.
Final question for you. On that topic of misery and Cain's example, I mean, obviously there's a massive depression, self-harm, suicide. In my generation, that's just it's just a general malaise, even if someone is not actively harming themselves. There just seems to be like a spirit sucked out of young people. And
it has been. That's exactly what's happened.
And how much of that? I mean, I think I've been very convinced by Jonathan Haidt and his cell phone use and really what that time is replacing. I mean, I really believe that that's a a causal thread in all this, but how much do you chalk up to a lack of spiritual grounding or a lack of a larger...
Well, it's all a lack of spiritual grounding. I mean, there are symptoms of that, and Haidt outlines the symptoms. That's a Tower of Babel symptom. People have fallen sway to the presumptuous technologists. That's exactly what happens in the Tower of Babel. So, and what happens in that story is that everyone fractionates and no one can communicate. Well, yeah, obviously, we can't even agree on what a man or a woman is. Words have lost their reference. Well, that's one indication that you're in a Tower of Babel. Is that going to cause misery? It's like, definitely. So that's a causal pathway. What's the way out? Well, we've been talking about that. You need to know the stories. You need to know the stories. They orient you. And so if you don't know them, see, you could say that when God died, in Nietzsche's terminology, which is something that's happened many times in human history, by the way, not just once, the unifying ethos collapses. And then you could say the world becomes meaningless. But that's not right. That isn't what happens. What happens is the world becomes hell. And the hell is characterized by suffering. So you might say, well, life is meaningless. No, it's not. Misery, that's meaning. Pain, terror, grief, resentment, those are meanings. Now, they might not be the ones you want. They're the meanings of hell. They're meanings. There's no escaping meaning. Right, and so that collapse into nihilism, there's no such thing. No one ends up, I feel nothing. It's like, no, someone who feels nothing is feeling pain, is feeling anxiety, is lost. And so that's still meaning. Well, what's the antidote? Well, that's a great question. What's the antidote to mortal suffering? Well, that's what the biblical stories are about. And they're right. So Christ is the Redeemer in the biblical story, in the Christian story anyways. And he's the one who takes the sins of the world unto himself. That's the Redeemer. What does that mean? Well, the sins of the world are everything that human beings could do wrong. Okay, that's your problem. Right? Dostoevsky knew that. He said as much. He said, everything that happens in the world is your fault. And you think, oh man, that's crazy. It's like, yes, at one level of analysis, it's crazy, it's grandiose, it's manic in a way. But there's another way of looking at it, which is, what would the world be like if you were everything you could be? So you'd be way better than you are. Well, then there'd be an effect of that, a radiating effect. Well, how all-encompassing could that radiating effect be? Well, you don't know. Far more than you think, because you're more than you think by a lot. And you have to know that, because otherwise the misery just consumes you. And, young men in particular, although young men have been demoralized and young women have been tempted down the garden path. There are different patterns of pathologization. It's partly is that young women have been tempted to believe that they are and should be young men, and young men have been demoralized so that the masculine field is fallow. But that's not good for, completely terrible for both. You can't kill off one sex. That isn't how human beings work. You demoralize. That's not going to happen. So the pathway out of misery, the pathway out of self-conscious misery is adoption of responsibility. And that's a weird thing. See, this is one of the things conservatives didn't know, because conservatives are always going, grow up, make your bed, put things in order. You should. They're right, you should. But there's another element to it, which is there isn't anything better than you can do if you do it voluntarily. You just look around. You can start this for everybody who's demoralized. You can just start this wherever. Look around and see something that's not in order. If you look, it'll call to you. You'll see, well, that's not where it should be. Put it where it should be. And then just learn that. And then wherever you go, just put some things where they should be and get expert at that. Put everything in your closet where it should be. By your own dictates. It's like, I want to make this closet perfect. Well, it's a little bit of the world. It's like the world. It's just a small bit, but it's connected with the world. If you can figure out how to make your closet perfect, Now you figured out how to make something perfect. You'll learn a lot. You'll learn about aesthetics. You'll learn about taste. You'll learn about balance. You'll learn about discipline. You'll learn about how to figure out what clothes you need to wear to go to places that you need to go. You'll figure out how to set your belongings in order so that they serve your purposes. It's extremely useful. It's a little microcosm there. It's not nothing. It's a realm of possibility. And anyone can do that. You can start and you think, well, that's, what difference does that make? It's like, what do you think you're capable of? If you can do something bigger, go ahead. But if you can't, on your knees, do that. And it is kind of humiliating. I had clients who were very messed up, very chaotic lives, and we'd start with the simplest thing that they could do. And everyone can start there. You start with the simplest thing that you can do. Well, that goes like this. Right? It's not linear, it's exponential. So even if you start with nothing virtually, it doesn't matter because it's an exponential trajectory. So.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Dr.
No
Peterson,
problem.
and congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet you in person.
Very nice to meet you in person as well.